This is the first case for today. This is a
Yeah.
7-year-old female child who presented with mass per abdomen since 3 weeks. The child has come from West Bengal, and there's no hematuria or hypertension in the examination. On laboratory investigations, we found HB was 11.4, total count of 4,920 with neutrophils of 56%. Platelets 2.87 lakh. Other parameters were normal. LDH 918. Ultrasonography showed it was a large heteroechoic lesion measuring 11 centimeters noted in the left renal fossa. It was replacing the renal parenchyma medially. Lesion was crossing the midline, encasing the renal vessels. On Doppler, we found there was no renal vein or IVC thrombosis. The CT will be discussed.
Yeah. Can the concerned fellow from pathology please discuss the CT findings for this child?
Yes, ma'am. See the screen, ma'am?
Yes, we can. Please.
So I'll start with the plain scans.
Yeah.
I'll first discuss the lesion. There is a large heterodense lesion, most probably arising from the mid and lower poles of the left kidney, with solid and cystic components. And in the lower aspect, we can see that there are hyperdensities within the lesion and fluid levels.
Okay.
Again, so these are suspicious of probably intratumoral hemorrhage. And when we go down, we can see that there is ascites in the pelvis, and in the plain scan, that's it. Then we go to the contrast. First, I'll discuss the abdominal findings. Coming to the lesion itself, the lesion is heterogeneously enhancing, and in the posterior superior aspect, we can see that there is remnant normal renal parenchyma here. And as we go down, we can see that yes, there are non-enhancing areas which can correspond to the cystic and the necrotic areas, and fluid levels and hyperdensities as seen, and ascites. Now, the size of the lesion is approximately 16 by 11 centimeters, and when we see that it is predominantly well circumscribed, but in the lower aspect, I feel there is some discontinuity in the capsule of the lesion. Now, this can represent possible rupture, but it is yet to be seen. And because ascites is a feature of possible or probable rupture, and as per literature, another sign of probable rupture is intratumoral hemorrhage, which is usually not seen. But in this, it is seen. And also, what we can see is there is peritumoral fat standing here, and yes, that's it. So, three probable signs. Yes. So that was about the primary lesion. Now, coming to the other findings, coming to the liver. So another thing that the presence of a tumor thrombus in the left atrial vein and extending into the IVC, right up till the junction of the IVC to the right atrium, and which is seen here, and it's enhancing. So that's why we will call it as a tumor thrombus. In the liver, what we can see is that there is a well-defined subcapsular lesion here, and this is it is hypoenhancing as compared to the background parenchyma of the liver, but still suspicious for metastasis. Now, another finding in the liver, which we see in segment 6, we can see that there is a non-enhancing linear structure here, and we can see that there is a attenuation difference between this segment and the other segment of the liver. Now, this can be a thrombosed branch of the portal vein, which is supplying this part of the liver. Attenuation difference can be because of that. Correlating that, because of the presence of tumor thrombus, these can be microemboli also. Now, particularly with respect to the prognosis and also the surgery, which what I can see is that in the contralateral kidney, there are multiple hypoenhancing lesions all over the right kidney. These are oblong shaped, reaching up to the cortex. However, again, so these are suspicious for nephrogenic res. Whether these are nephroblastomatosis as such, it is difficult to say at this stage.
Okay.
But definitely, because of the presence of a contralateral Wilms tumor, the right kidney, these are definitely suspicious for nephrogenic res, and these have to be checked upon on surgery.
Okay.
Now, when I come to the lung window, even though this is an abdominal scan, few slides of the lung are there. In this, we can see just right at the first slice, we can see that there is a small, well-defined solid nodule in the right lower lobe. Now, this is suspicious for metastasis, considering that there is a tumor thrombus, there is liver mets, and lung is the first site for metastasis for Wilms tumor. Now, the skeletal structures are particularly normal. Ribs and the vertebral bodies are normal, and the pelvis is also normal.
Okay.
Now, there was a clinical query that the child initially had presented with features of intestinal obstruction, possible constipation also. That is a presenting complaint. So when we reviewed this pre-chemo CT, there's no evidence of a transition point as such, even though we can see that there are the few jejunal loops are thickened, but there's not enough evidence to call it as an intestinal obstruction. This, because of the presence of 3 probable signs of tumor rupture, the clinical features can be correlated with paralytic ileus.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Dr. Anadi. So basically, you would like to label it as a metastatic stage 4 Wilms tumor with query nephrogenic rests in the contralateral kidney and possible tumor rupture associated with it, correct?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay, fine. So, one thing is are you absolutely sure that there is tumor rupture, or it is still doubtful, although there are signs of ascites and peritumoral fat stranding? Because see, that is going to change our management as to whether we're going to be giving whole abdominal RT or only flank RT. So,
Yes,
would you like to say categorically that there is tumor rupture in this child?
Ma'am, as per the literature, when we see the features of rupture, 3 features fit into this.
Okay.
So, and it's also said that when there is fluid beyond the cul-de-sac, it is possible of rupture.
Okay.
So the exact site we're not able to ascertain, but I think if we can, when we tell the surgeon that okay, there can be a rupture, then when he goes in, he can definitely search for it.
Okay.
A fluid can be sent for cytology also.
Yeah, that's a good point actually. The fluid which was present, probably that could have been sent for cytology. So now what I would like to discuss is I did review the literature a little bit. What would be the indications for an emergency nephrectomy? I would like to know from the surgeons, they would have seen a lot of children like this with Wilms tumor. And does this child warrant an emergency nephrectomy, or we can still have a conservative approach, give chemotherapy, reduce the size of the tumor, and then go ahead with nephrectomy? Would anybody like to take this question? Sir, Gavri sir? Yes, sir.
So you're not audible.
Hello? Hello? So...
Ma'am, tumor rupture per se will not be an indication for emergency surgery unless there is hemodynamic instability is what we have known. I don't know if there is anything other than this.
I'm audible.
Yes, sir, please.
Yeah, basically, I would completely agree with what Vinu is saying. See,
yes, sir.
For tumor rupture, there are 2 things.
Yes,
One
sir.
is tumor rupture. See, Wilms tumor is a tumor of the kidney, which is essentially a retroperitoneal organ.
Yes, sir.
The tumor rupture happens and it is still confined to the retroperitoneum.
Yes, sir.
No urgency to go and remove it. Because even if you go and try to remove it, it's not going to be, we are not going to alter the stage in any way. One. But
yes, sir.
There will be more amount of residue.
Yes, sir.
So no urgent necessity to go. But and if there's a transperitoneal rupture or a bleeding into the tumor, or
yes, sir.
there's a ruptured Wilms where hemodynamic instability, the child is not well, there's the only where we are going to go for emergency nephrectomy. Otherwise, definitely not be keen to do anything.
Yeah, I agree, sir. So whatever literature I could review, this was published in the European Journal of Pediatric Surgery in 2001, where 720 cases of non-metastatic Wilms were reviewed, whether those children had undergone emergency nephrectomy. So out of 720, only 24 children, that is about 3%, had undergone an emergency nephrectomy. The most common indication for an emergency nephrectomy was a massive bleed into the tumor, like you said, which is causing hemodynamic instability. This was seen as almost about 13 of the children out of 24. The next commonest indication was an acute abdomen post-rupture. And following that, only in 2 cases, where there was bowel occlusion, did they go ahead for an emergency nephrectomy. So the indications for emergency nephrectomy, 1 would be a massive bleed causing hemodynamic instability. 2nd would be an acute abdomen, again causing hemodynamic instability or shock-like features. and the third would be bowel occlusion in very rare cases. Fine.
I just want to add one point here.
Yes, sir, please.
See, in case of if there is any intratumoral bleed or if there is a capsule rupture,
Yes, sir.
we can as well take up the patient for embolization.
Okay, sir.
That is like minimally invasive compared
Yes,
to the nephrectomy. So
Yes, sir.
the renal vessel is easier to catheterize, and
Yes,
even you can go to the segmental vessels which is bleeding and block it.
Yes, sir. Like you said, I did read up. There was one case which had massive intratumoral bleed, which was managed with embolization. So, like you said, it's a feasible option in children where we want to go ahead and salvage or stabilize the child, sir.
Yeah, if we have a cath lab in Kidwai, we can utilize that
Yeah,
facility.
definitely, sir. Definitely. So next, Dr. Vinupriya.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
So next, we went ahead with the FNAC. FNAC, will they be discussing the FNAC now?
Yes, yes. They will be discussing the FNAC. Dr. Sulagna, will you be discussing the FNAC for this child? Yeah.
Hello, I'm not discussing the FNAC for this child.
Okay. Who will be
Dr.
discussing?
Kritika will, Dr. Kritika will be.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, Dr.
Yes.
Kritika, please go ahead. Slides are not moving, Dr. Kritika? Hello?
Yeah,
Hello?
yeah. Hello, I'm just presenting. Yeah, the case details and radiology details were shared, and
Yeah.
the USG guided FNAC was done from the lesion,
Yeah.
and we made cellular smears in which
Yeah.
there were different areas.
Yeah.
And one of the areas here which showed the spindly cells which were arranged in papilloid clusters,
Okay.
and which is suggestive of a mesenchymal component.
Okay.
And the other areas were looking like this, where there are small round cells which were closely packed. The picture B is a Jeamsa stain slide, where you can see the small round cells which are closely arranged with scanty amount of cytoplasm.
Yes.
The pictures of other areas where also we could see that there were small round cells like this, which is
Okay.
suggestive of an blastomal component morphologically. So we went ahead with the cell block and IHC study, and sections from the cell block also showed the similar features, like there were sheets of small round cells, and other area had this kind of spindly cells arranged with myxoid background, which is again suggestive of a mesenchymal component.
Okay.
So we did the IHC study on the section, which showed WT1 negative. That it should be nuclear positive. It should show nuclear staining to say it as positive, but this case had cytoplasmic staining, so it was declared as negative.
Negative.
And cytokeratin, it was focally positive. And
Okay.
again, another areas just showed patchy areas like this with positivity. And considering the age and site, we had to rule out other small round cell tumors, and we did the workup with other markers like CD99 and NKX 2.2 and CD45.
Can you just elaborate, Dr. Kritika, for what you had done these markers? Yeah, your voice is not audible. Yeah, yeah. Tell me.
CD45 for a lymphoma,
Yes.
chromogranin for a neuroblastoma,
Yeah.
and Desmin for an RMS.
Right.
Yeah, all these were negative. So, correlating the radiological findings and the morphology, we gave a final impression of Wilms tumor.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Can you just elaborate what happened with the child next?
Yes, ma'am. Okay. So next, because the already metastatic workup was positive for metastatic growth, it was declared as metastatic tumor state. So what happened with this child? Child initially prior to chemotherapy itself was child presented with
Hello.
bilious vomiting. So we suspected a subacute intestinal obstruction, and we managed it conservatively, and child responded. So we referred back for neoadjuvant chemotherapy. Child received 2 cycles of neoadjuvant chemotherapy as per SIOP protocol. So the first cycle was vincristine, second cycle was vincristine, actinomycin D, and doxorubicin. What happened immediately after the second cycle was child completed the second cycle on 21st, and from the next day itself, the child presented with again bilious vomiting and colicky pain abdomen.
Okay.
We tried a conservative approach, but then bilious aspirates were too high, 300 to 500 per day. So we had to plan for an emergency surgery for this child. Before emergency surgery, we planned for a CCT abdomen.
Dr. Anadi, can you just discuss the CCT abdomen post chemotherapy?
Yes, ma'am. So, first I'll start because in this case, in this post chemo CT, higher sections of the lung was taken. So I'll start from there. What we can see is that as we go down,
Yeah.
in the pre-chemo CT, we could only see one because of the limited section. But here we can see that there are many more nodules on the right side and in the right lower lobe, and also on the left side there were one to two. Now coming to the abdominal findings. So in this case, one issue which actually results in a suboptimal evaluation is probably that this child was given barium as an oral contrast, and barium, because of its high atomic number, it causes a lot of streak attacks. So anyway, so in this case, again, the tumor thrombus and the liver mets are the same, size of the lesion is the same. The main query was, is there an obstruction or not? Yes, the stomach is dilated, but it's not suggestive of it. There is an nasogastric tube within. There are few jejunal loops, dilated jejunal loops here, but as such, even though, I mean, we searched completely, but we couldn't find a transition point as such to call it as definitive intestinal obstruction. Considering that there is ascites, there is perinephric fat standing, query, tumor rupture, and the child was on chemotherapy for 2 cycles, this is most likely suggestive of a paralytic ileus. And yes, and the bleed within the tumor also has had increased because of these hypertensive ileus. So most likely the symptoms were because of a paralytic ileus.
Paralytic ileus.
These causes. A transition point was not seen, so it is unlikely to be intestinal obstruction because of mechanical cause.
All right. What do you exactly mean by a transition point, Dr. Nadi?
So the transition point is that, like, so the transition point will be the area that is causing the intestinal obstruction, and the dilated loops will come and stop at a point, and then any loop distal to that will be collapsed. So we see such an appearance wherein there is a sudden abrupt narrowing in a bowel loop, and then any bowel loop distal to that is collapsed. So that point will be called as transition point. And intra-op, when we go in, most likely that will be the point of obstruction, and that has to be looked for specifically.
Okay. So now what I understand is whatever features like bilious aspirate this child was having was probably because of the post chemotherapy, like she had been given VCR, was because of the post chemotherapy paralytic ileus. However, the child's general condition was not very great, and like we had two options with the intratumoral bleed also increasing, either to wait conservatively for this child or to operate. And I think the surgeons felt that the bleed was quite significant, and the child was not doing very well. So the child was taken up for surgery, and she underwent a nephrectomy. Dr. Vinpriya?
Yes, ma'am. So, with the background of a metastatic Wilms tumor with suspicion of a gastrointestinal obstruction, we're thinking whether to go in for surgery or to continue with the neoadjuvant. But because the child didn't settle even with 5 to 6 days of conservative approach, we had to go plan an emergency surgery for the child. It was done on 28th. So there was a tumor of 15 cross 15 centimeters with the rupture or the capsule breach was noted, which was there medially. And it was adherent, the tumor was noted to be adherent to anterior abdominal wall, small bowel to be specific jejunum and ileum, and descending colon and left ovary. And there were multiple areas of tumor necrosis. Clinically, we didn't find any renal vein or artery thrombosis. And there was enlarged paraaortic nodes. So the child had to undergo multiple bowel resections and anastomosis. Child had 3 anastomosis at the end: ileo-ileal, ileocolic, and colic. What happened in the post-operative period is noted on day 0, that is immediate post-op, the HP was 8.6, total count of 3,700, neutrophils of 69%, and platelet had dropped to 37,000. And the similar picture on day 2, HP had dropped to 5.2, total count of 5,300, and platelet of 69,000. On day 3 onwards, the total count and platelet started improving, but there was a persistent low HB. And day 4, this is post transfusion, we have HB of 15.6, total count improved to 20,000, and platelet of 2.92 lakh. But what we noted on day 4 was an anastomotic leak with pelvic collection. So we had to re-explore the child. And when we re-explored the child, there was partial dehiscence of all the 3 anastomosis with flakes and wound. And all the anastomosis were reinforced, and we have done an ileostomy.
Okay. Can you just go back to the previous slide, Vinapriya?
Yes.
The one, yeah, the table. So, like this child was almost day 10 post-op, like around day 10 post-op or around day 4 post-op when, sorry, she was day 4 post-op when I had seen the child, and this child was showing thrombocytopenia. So our 2 basic suspicions were either the child had a leak leading to a peritonitis and causing a sepsis-like picture, or it was post-chemotherapy induced myelosuppression which was causing this picture. So we upgraded the antibiotic for this child, and simultaneously I think the marrow also started recovering after that, and the child showed an improvement in her counts and her general condition. Post that, she still was having some respiratory distress and bronchospasm, and her chest had some crepitation. So the child was also ventilated for 1 day, and immediately next day she was successfully extubated, and as of now she is doing fine. She's maintaining her urine output, and her electrolytes have normalized, and her respiratory distress has settled. So post-op she's doing fine now. So now the next question that I would like to ask, like any of my surgery colleagues can take this question, is what are the post-operative complications that are commonly encountered in patients with Wilms tumor?
Can I come in, Pooja?
Yes, sir, please.
To start with, this is a relatively unusual case wherein Wilms tumor, which was the pre-op diagnosis, had such level of adhesions with the small bowel loops.
Yes, sir.
So it was sort of an invasion, or you can say there was a invasion into the bowel loops. That is one thing which we won't notice routinely. That's one thing.
Yes,
the
sir.
second thing is child was not nutritionally good. There was hypoalbuminemia.
Yes, sir.
And the child had little bit of sort of edema. Now, it was not a case which was sort of fit for surgery to take up the anastomosis probably. So on the table, we were contemplating, should we do anastomosis at all with the albumin of say 1.5 or 1.7 was the albumin.
Okay,
and these were the bowel, these were the additions which we could not separate at all.
Yes,
and when we were trying to separate things, probably the capsular breach was increasing in size and things like that. So that is when we decided, although there were 3 anastomosis which were needed to be done, we
Yes,
thought
sir.
we'll go ahead. But probably because of that, and there was post-op, probably the child was on ventilator for 2-3 days.
Yes,
And
sir.
then it slowly improved, but then we had a high suspicion of leak, and then we did a dye study, and all the 3 anastomosis had given way, in the sense
Okay.
multiple sutures had given way.
Yes, sir.
So Preoperatively, the child was nutritionally not so well, so that
Yes,
was
sir.
the reason for probably this complication. Although
Yes.
it is rare in Wilms tumor, we don't generally do a bowel anastomosis. That's one point.
Yes, sir.
And right now, child is relatively better, as you told. The
Yes.
second anastomosis we have just opened and did a ileostomy. The proximal anastomosis we have reinforced, and the colonic anastomosis also we have reinforced. Child is slowly recovering.
Yes, sir.
And surprisingly, it is only Wilms. Once there was all this invasion into bowel loops and the metastasis was seen, we thought it might be something other than Wilms also. But
Yes.
no, it
Wilms.
turned out to be probably Wilms. Yeah. Thank
Yes,
you.
sir.
Yeah,
Thank you.
can I also add in Deepak?
Yes, sir. Please.
Yeah, basically, as I told, in fact, I will take the responsibility for taking the decision on what do you call resection anastomosis, because Deepak was operating, and he was in a dilemma whether to do anastomosis or not. I am the one who pushed for, because mainly I thought tumor clearance will be better if you take it out rather than trying to denude the tumor, because it is densely infiltrating.
Yes, sir.
So that is why we said we will go in for at least for resection anastomosis. But as Deepak said, the child's nutrition perhaps led to the anastomotic leak, because it is technical issue. It must have been only one, but all three anastomosis having issues means obviously it's a nutritional issue. The only question is, it is a right decision as far as trying to get the tumor clearance. But was it the timing appropriate, or could you have given the child nutrition to go in? I don't know. Maybe that's a question to be answered. I think that's what Deepak is trying to raise.
Fine, sir.
No, considering that there was bilious aspirate which was not settling down, probably going in was a fairly good decision at that point of time. Otherwise, there was obstruction. Wherever the infiltration or adhesion was there was collapse distal to it. The infiltration was there at multiple levels. So distal to it, there was a collapse, and proximal to it, there was dilatation. Clinically, on table, we were able to make that out. So it was a good decision to go in on an emergency basis at that point of time, probably.
Yes, sir. Other complications, sir, just for the postgraduate students who are attending, like other complications which we anticipate in post-nephrectomy in children with Wilms tumor, other than intestinal obstruction, bleeds.
It's mainly intestinal obstruction, Pooja. Either because
Okay,
of obstruction or because of excessive handling some amount of ileus.
Okay, sir.
Bleeding or etc. are very rare.
Okay, sir.
We haven't seen any complications beyond that.
Okay. So, like, I did review some literature, sir, and they said that, like, in one particular study, which was reported in 2001, the incidence of surgical complications can be as high as 20%, they said. And like you said, intestinal obstruction is the commonest, followed by extensive intraoperative hemorrhage, injuries to other visceral organs, as well as, like, if there is IVC thrombus or other renal vessels which are involved, there can be vascular injuries as well. So in that particular study, these were the 4 complications which were reported. And what they said was, like, those children who have an advanced local tumor stage or who have intravascular tumor extension, they are more likely to have post-op complications. Now, sir, I think Dr.
Pooja?
Yes, sir. Sir?
Pooja, 1 second.
Yes, sir, please.
One unique post-op complication of Wilms tumor nephrectomy is a intussusception. It's a very unique complication.
Yes, sir.
Another complication which many of us have seen is either transient or a troubling chylous ascites.
Okay, sir.
Very often it is transient, but sometimes it can be a troubling chylous ascites. And almost all of us, 100% of the time, we don't put a drain after doing a nephrectomy.
Yeah.
So it will present as a ascites, post-op ascites. And when you do the sampling, you'll find out that it is chylous ascites.
Chylous ascites.
Very often it will settle down, but it can be troubling at times. But intussusception is a very, very unique classical post-operative complication of nephrectomy for Wilms tumor.
Sir,
Yes, sir.
for interception, sir?
What is that?
Reason, sir, for interception?
It is just known to occur, and it is usually not the classical ileocolic interception we see. It's a small bowel to small bowel interception.
Okay, sir.
Which forces you to go in and do surgery for these patients.
Sir.
Thank you so much, sir. Okay, so now we have the histopathology also for this child. I think we just got it recently. So, like, if we are not ready with it from pathology, I think we can just read out the report. Is that okay?
Yes. So
Yeah.
this was histopathology we have received today. It's a triphasic WIMS with 30% blastomal, 10% epithelial, and 60% stromal component. Chemotherapy-induced changes are up to 70%. There is no
Yeah.
aplasia noted.
Yeah.
Renal sinus, capsule, gerota, serosal surface of intestines are known to be involved with tumor necrosis.
Okay.
And then renal vein, I'm sorry to add IVC here. Renal vein ureter are free from the tumor. There is no nephroblastomatosis seen.
Okay. Yeah. So this child now, I think it has been reported as a regressive tumor, which comes as an intermediate risk. So metastatic intermediate risk tumor. She has lung nodules. So we've given only 2 cycles of chemotherapy. So it is actually quite early to comment on whether there has been response to therapy or not. So ideally, we would be giving at least 6 weeks of chemotherapy and then assessing the lung nodules and deciding what to do further. So at this point, it will be too early to discuss what we should be doing further with this child. But what we can discuss, I think, in this particular child is the radiotherapy. So I think Dr. Tanveer is here. Good afternoon, sir. This child has had a stormy post-op course. And ideally speaking, in a Wilms tumor, how soon would you want to start radiotherapy, in such children? And in this child, where she's had tumor rupture possibly, and she has metastatic lung nodules, what would be the strategy for radiotherapy, sir?
Yeah, earlier the better. That's what is referred. Within
Yes, sir.
10 days to 14 days is an ideal time to start radiation in the post-op setting.
Yes, sir.
And depending on the involvement of the peritoneum or not, we'll decide only on whole abdominal radiation or only flank radiation.
Okay, sir.
So post-op, if there is a residual disease, we use whole flank radiation of 10.8 gray followed by another boost to the residual disease of another 10.8 gray. Otherwise, if there is no residual disease, then just 10.8 gray should suffice.
Okay.
So, lung metastasis, as of now, most of them would prefer to see the lung response post chemo.
Yes, sir.
Lot of complications we expect irradiating bilateral lungs.
Yes, sir.
So if there is a complete response post chemo, lung may not be addressed with radiation.
Okay,
If
sir.
there is a residual disease post chemo, then we would like to irradiate bilateral lung with 12 gray in 8 fractions.
Yes, sir.
And we would also now, with the advent of newer techniques, we would also use, we would try to use the most advanced techniques like VMAT or IMRT to address these issues so that we can spare as many normal tissues as possible, especially the heart and,
Yes.
and the thyroid gland and things like that. So there minimizes the dose to these critical structures and optimal outcomes can be gained with minimal long-term side effects.
Point well taken, sir. So in this case, like I said, only 2 cycles of chemotherapy. Normally, if this child would have had an not such a stormy course, she would have received around 6 cycles of 3 drug-based chemotherapy. At the end of 6 weeks, we would have assessed for what is the response in the lung nodules, and then decided whether the child will need radiotherapy to the lungs or not. And like sir said, the take-home message here is that in Wilms tumor, within 10 to 14 days, radiotherapy should be initiated in these children.
Sir, I have
So now,
Sir, suppose this child now we have done a preoperative CT which showed that there was ascites and probable capsule breach. So this comes to almost a generalized, it's a tumor rupture. Now suppose if the child didn't have this course and had a normal 6 cycle of neoadjuvant chemo and went ahead with surgery, and during surgery that ascites or the tumor rupture part was not seen, but still on adjuvant radio child will receive whole abdominal RT, or how is it?
Just the spill at the time of surgery, we can restrict our radiation to flank itself.
okay.
Yeah, during surgery, if it is a spillover, then we restrict ourselves to the flank itself. We don't give whole abdominal because we irradiate at the earliest within 10 days. So the chances of the whole peritoneal spread will be less in that situation.
So this is
Yeah, actually-
even if pre-chemo CT showed ascites and tumor rupture.
Yeah, that's what I also want.
Yeah, then you will use whole abdominal radiation.
Yeah, in this case, sir, she had fluid in the cul sac as well as
we use whole abdominal radiation in this
whole
situation.
abdominal.
Yeah.
Fine, sir.
Ma'am,
Also, this tumor was adherent to anterior abdomen wall,
Okay.
and it was growing out of the flanks. Frankly, it was almost crossing the midline in the lower part.
Yeah. So in such situations, if you are unable to remove the tumor in toto, then a boost of another 10.8 gray would give to the residual disease which is left behind. That would be the way to go ahead to manage. Yeah.
Yes, sir. But in this case, we were able to remove the tumor in toto, sir.
Yeah, fine.
This second case is about a 4-year male child presented with abdominal pain since 3 weeks, progressive and continuous in nature. His vitals were stable. On examination, abdomen is soft and non-tender, and no mass was palpable. On blood investigation, CBC RF2 was normal, LDH was 393, alpha fetoprotein and beta HCG were normal. USG showed evidence of well-defined ovoid mixed echogenic lesion, predominantly hyperechoic, noted in the presacral region. Lesion was approximately measuring 42 into 42 into 66 mm. There was minimal vascularity noted within the lesion.
The MRI will be described by, I think, Dr. Anadi only from radiology.
No, ma'am. Dr. Anusha will be taking over.
Yeah, Dr. Anusha, please. Full screen.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir.
Yes, ma'am. These are the ultrasound images taken at the presacral location. So here we can see the sacral vertebra. So this is the oval-shaped hypoechoic presacral lesion showing multiple calcifications within. So these echogenic foci are calcifications. And on color Doppler, there is increase in the uptake. There is a color uptake. So it implies there is internal vascularity. So these are the plain CT images where we can see a large presacral mass lesion showing calcifications within. And this is the bone window in sagittal section where we can see the lesion is abutting the sacrum posteriorly, but no obvious bone erosions are noted. So these are the MRI images where we can see relatively well-defined T1 hypointense and T2 intermediate to hyperintense lesion in the presacral region, which is seen displacing the rectum anterolaterally and displacing the urinary bladder anteriorly. And laterally on right side, the lesion is abutting the right iliopsoas muscle as well as the external iliac vessels. So this is the T2 image where we can see hypointense areas within, which corresponds to the calcifications that are seen on plain CT. So this is the sagittal T2 image where we can see the lesion is abutting the sacrum posteriorly, and we are not able to see any altered signal intensities in the bone. So that means the bone involvement is not there. And these are the post-contrast images where we can see heterogeneous post-contrast enhancement of the lesion. And these are the diffusion vector images and stir images at the corresponding sections where bilateral external iliac nodes are noted. And also we can see iliac nodes. So abdomen screening shows normal liver and normal kidneys. So based on the imaging appearance, DDs would be of small round cell tumors like rhabdomyosarcoma, soft tissue weavings of peanut, and neurogenic tumors, because the lesions are intermediate to hyperintense on T2 weighted images, and depending on the site, it can be malignant teratoma also.
Okay, fine.
So coming to the question, ma'am.
Yeah, first I would like to ask one question, sir. Like this tumor showed extensive calcifications, right? So
Yes.
in that case, why was RMS considered as a first option? Like, is calcification normally seen in RMS, or like it's more common in neuroblastoma like tumors?
Calcifications are more common in both teratoma and neuroblastoma than rhabdomyosarcoma, ma'am. But
Yeah.
based on the appearance on T2 weighted images, it is more like intermediate to hyperintense. So
Okay.
yeah, depending on the MR appearance, we gave it as like first TD would be of RMS.
Okay. Of presacral lesions that we see in this age group, which are some of the commonest lesions that are seen? Like, you can take
Commonest are like teratomas and everything else is a rare only, ma'am, in that side.
Yeah.
But depending on the exactly like MR images,
Yeah.
we would have to give RMS as first TD, ma'am.
Okay. So, other than the calcifications, did you see any other feature that would suggest that it could be a teratoma, any cystic areas, or any other
No, ma'am.
differentiation?
It is
Nothing.
completely solid and only calcifications are seen within the lesion. No
Okay.
fat component, no cystic component.
Okay. Can you just illustrate for everybody what would be the differences or between a PCT versus a neuroblastoma?
Coming to the germ cell tumors versus neuroblastoma, in a presacral location, the most common pediatric tumors are sacrococcygeal teratoma. It is the most common germ cell tumor that occurs in the presacral region, and all the other non-teratomatous germ cell tumors are extremely rare in this location. So this is the Altman classification showing the 4 types of sacrococcygeal teratoma. In type 1, we can see predominant extrapelvic component with a small intrapelvic component. Type 2, there will be significant intrapelvic component. Type 3, there will be intrapelvic as well as intra-abdominal component.
Yeah.
And in type 4, only intrapelvic component can be seen. So in these first 3 types, ma'am,
Yeah.
it is easy to differentiate it from the other lesions like neuroblastomas and RMS because it is very rare for them to come into the extrapelvic component.
Okay.
Like extrapelvic component.
Yeah, I got that.
So there will be a need to differentiate type 4 sacrococcygeal teratoma versus a neurogenic tumor like neuroblastoma.
Okay.
So these are the few differences that I could make, ma'am. These are like, it is typical to benign. The incidence of the sacrococcygeal teratomas in the presacral region is more common, whereas in case of pelvic neuroblastoma, the incidence is only 2 to 4%, ma'am. And calcifications and cystic components can be seen in both the conditions. But regarding fat, it is a typical feature of teratoma. It is very rare in neuroblastoma. So if we are able to see a fat in a presacral lesion, then we can narrow down the diagnosis to teratoma, and we could exclude neuroblastoma.
Okay.
And it is very difficult to differentiate the malignant teratoma and neuroblastoma, ma'am,
Yeah.
because both they show intraspinal extension.
Yeah.
And moreover, malignant will be completely solid, and the typical features which we see in benign teratoma may not be visible on in the malignant counterpart of the teratoma. So it will be completely solid with a few calcifications within. So in that case, we can't differentiate between these 2 entities.
Now, my next question to you is, Anusha, like, are there any features suggested on this CT which tell you that it is more likely to be a malignant lesion rather than a benign lesion, or it is difficult to make out on the imaging?
Difficult to make out on the imaging, ma'am, because it is a malignant teratoma versus neuroblastoma. It is a completely solid lesion, ma'am, without any fat component. So it is very difficult to differentiate between these 2 entities, ma'am.
Okay.
As per this case is concerned.
Okay, fine.
These are few case reports, ma'am, and even with same scenario, because pre-imaging wise they have decided it as a sacrococcygeal teratoma, and
Yeah.
they have updated also, and it turned out to be neuroblastoma. So it is advised that whenever a presacral mass lesion is seen in a pediatric age group, which is not fitting into a typical teratoma, we should always give a video of neuroblastoma, even though it is a rare lesion.
Okay, fine. I think, Dr. Akshit, would you like to take over, or you wanted to tell the course of what has happened for this child?
Start.
So this child, on basis of the imaging findings that we had, it was the most likely diagnosis, like you said, was a presacral DCT, and it was probably thought that it's most likely to be a mature teratoma, and they went ahead with the surgery for this child. So can you describe the intra findings, Dr.
Intraproperly, there was a 7 to 5 centimeter mass arising from the presacral region. Mass was well encapsulated, and it was adhered to the sacral wall. There were multiple enlarged lymph nodes, each of more than 2 centimeters surrounding the lesion, and there was mesocolon involvement as well.
Okay. Okay, so the histopath of the post-op specimen was a googly for everyone because everybody was quite convinced it was a mature teratoma and it turned out to be a ganglioneuroblastoma. So, yeah, can you just describe the findings from pathology? Who will be discussing this case?
I will be discussing.
Yeah, Pooja,
please.
before we go
Yes,
to the histopathology,
Yes, sir.
am I audible?
Yes, sir, please.
Operatively itself, we had a lot of problems because initially we thought it's a well-matured neuroblastoma. It looked well circumscribed.
Yes, sir.
We thought we'll be able to get away with it. In fact, we started with laparoscopy.
Yes, sir.
I could see that the mass was behind the rectum and in front of the sacrum.
Yes, sir.
The plane on one side, but we are not able to dissect further because it is densely adherent.
Okay.
Even an opening, we realized that it was not easily coming out because teratomas will have a fairly clear-cut capsule.
Yes, sir.
And removal becomes fairly easy.
Yes, sir.
But we had really a tough time. I was assisting Vinay and I found it extremely difficult because it was sort of stuck to all the pelvic structures and it took a lot of rough dissection to get it out. And perhaps that should have alerted us that there could have been a ganglioneuroblastoma.
Yes,
because
sir.
ganglioneuromas and ganglioneuroblastomas always tend to be so densely adherent.
Okay,
Even
sir.
benign, the flip side of the whole thing is that they are difficult to excise in toto. But
Yes, sir.
they tend to get stuck.
Yes, sir.
Other thing we found out was basically apart from the main mass, there are 3 or 4 things which are adjacent to that, which initially look like a lymph node on laparoscopy.
Yes,
But
sir.
we found out that there are fairly hardish masses. So we excised all of them and sent, and the biopsy came out that they are metastasis.
Okay.
I would
Thanks,
like histopathology to take over.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So we received excised specimen. It was actually a globular encapsulated soft tissue mass, which was measuring 7 into 5 into 3 centimeter. And on the cut section, we saw that from the encapsulated lesion, we saw solid areas, which was glistening white areas. And along with, we also saw like few areas of like necrosis, along with the areas of calcification, and also the cystic changes were also noted. So on microscopy, we saw actually it consists of an intermix of the 2 components. So first, the neuroblastomal component, which composed of the small round 2 oval cells and with very scant amount of cytoplasm and hyperchromatic nuclei. This is a small low power view and this is the high power view. And along with, and the lesions, it was well encapsulated, right, nodular. So, and also we saw there was a Schwannian stroma differentiation. This is the low power view and this is the high power view. So, and there was abundant areas of necrosis and also areas of calcifications were also seen. And the mitotic karyoretic index, it was like the 3% of the tumor consisting of the mitotic and karyoretic cells, which we gave as an intermediate category. So based on the morphology, so we gave a diagnosis of ganglioneuroblastoma nodular. Moving to the fish, today we have got the report. Yeah. So the neoplastic cells actually show 2p gain of the NMYC gene. And as the article suggests that the 2p gain alteration has an unfavorable prognosis for the neuroblastoma patients.
Okay.
Talking a little about the classification of the peripheral neuroblastic tumors, it is generally based on the Schwannian stroma. Actually determines that about the, like we will be defining the category. So if it is a Schwannian stroma poor, then the neuroblastoma category is given, and that is again subdivided into undifferentiated, poorly differentiated, and differentiating. In the differentiating, so moving on to here, that this is the poorly differentiated variant of the neuroblastoma, where we see that hardly any neuropil is seen. Here is less than 5%, here more than 5%. And based on the Schwannian stroma reach, again that neuroblastoma intermixed type, and then the nodular variant, which was the case, and because we had the intermix pattern and the tumor cells were in nodules,
Yeah.
so, and it was Schwannian stroma reach also. So we gave the diagnosis of ganglioneuroblastoma nodular. So here is a picture that is depicting the nodular, where we have the 2 components of the Schwannian stroma component and the neuroblastoma component, and the last is the ganglioneuroma.
Okay.
So yeah, so
Okay.
that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sulagna. So it was a ganglionieuroblastoma nodular composite, like both Schwannian stroma dominant and other areas were seen. So, Dr. Anusha, now that you know that it's a neuroblastoma, would you like to comment on the staging for this child and whether presence or absence of IDRF, whether they were there or not there? Hello? Can you hear me, Dr. Anusha? Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Have you had a look regarding the staging of the tumor? Review the CT findings and see whether it's an L1 or an L2 tumor, because that will help us in the risk stratification. So what I spoke to one of your colleagues, do you have any slides to repeat that, or I can tell you what I have discussed? That's all right. So yeah, I think this tumor is basically an L2 tumor, and there were certain image-defined risk factors. I'm not sure if you'll be able to show us those, because those are on the DICOM images. So there were presence already. It's been operated, so that's out of the discussion purview. So with a ganglioneuroblastoma nodular and NMIC being negative in a child of more than 4 years, what you need to look at next is the 11q abnormality. However, it's not very easily available in our setting, and like Dr. Sulagna already said that this child has got a 2p gain. So this child most probably will be categorized as an intermediate risk tumor. And the further course of therapy would definitely be chemotherapy cycles for this child, and then reassessment as to what is the response. So the ideal situation probably for this child would have been to do a biopsy. A biopsy would have proven the ganglioneuroblastoma, and then we would have given few cycles of chemotherapy, went ahead for surgery, and then completed the chemotherapy. But because it was a unique case where it was presenting as a presacral mass, we went ahead for upfront excision, and now post excision we'll be completing the the maximum 6 to 8 cycles of chemotherapy in this child.
Pooja,
Yes,
when it
sir.
comes to biopsy, preoperative biopsy,
Yes,
there
sir.
are going to be some issues.
Yes, sir.
For example, this is not going to be accessible from the abdomen.
Okay, sir.
Getting it from the abdomen, whether it is ultrasound guidance or CT guidance,
Yes,
because
sir.
there is a lot of bowel loops and then the bladder in front.
Yes,
So it
sir.
is not going to be easily accessible to hit it without hitting anything else.
Okay,
The
sir.
only way by which we could have done it is a
Yes, sir.
parectal biopsy.
Okay, sir.
Parectal.
Yes, sir.
Parectal, as I told, it will be maybe a simpler idea to do an FNAC.
Yes,
It may
sir.
not be sufficient.
Okay.
On the other hand, if we can do a true cut biopsy, it would have been good because the yield will be better.
Yes, sir.
But doing a true cut biopsy parectally into the mass, I'm not comfortable because I don't know what sort of complications will end up, especially if there's a tumor and if there's a needle track spread. So in this case, it would still be wary of trying to get a preoperative biopsy.
So, like
in this case, just I want to make a statement. For this case, we would have done percutaneous biopsy from the posterior aspect.
Yes, sir.
Without eating anything else. We would have directly hit the mass. So even transrectal is not feasible in these children. We cannot put a probe into rectum, such a big ones. So from the posterior aspect, we can easily do biopsy for this.
Okay.
Posterior
So
aspect, but from where, sir? Because it is presacral.
Yeah.
Sacrum is the head.
Yeah, I'll just show the. We'll show the. Yeah,
show the images.
I'm not able to see a window where you can get it from the posterior aspect, sir. That's why I was a little confused.
Just a second, sir. I will share the images.
No problem.
And one more thing I wanted to know, what is the status of notes?
There are metastatic. This thing is what.
Let me just cross check on the histology. Yes.
No, the nodes were metastatic. We had received metastatic nodes. Yes.
We categorize them as child as H2.
Yeah. Put CT only. That's enough. So we can see the CT scan image here. Axial. If you go to the axial section, there is a lot of space. The direction what my PG is showing. So there's a lot of space. It is easily doable. Even we do smaller lesions than this. This is very easy. Even forget about CT. If you bring the patient for ultrasound, we'll do it off.
Okay, I got that, sir. So my only reason for bringing this up was, like, in this child, we were quite sure, like, it looked like a teratoma and we went ahead for surgery. If it is an intermediate risk tumor, possibly giving pre-op chemotherapy and reducing the size of the tumor, maybe the prognosis would have definitely been better. So in future, if we get a child like this with a presacral mass, with an older age, it would probably be prudent to go ahead with a biopsy first and then decide the further course of action. What do you think, sir? That to a solid mass, like with not a lot of fat or typical features of a mature teratoma. Sir?
Yeah, I didn't get the question, please. Sorry.
No, not. And sir, this is basically directed to the surgeons. I completely take your point. My point in this child, the point I wanted to make was, like, we went ahead with the surgery first, and of course, it's been done in literature also because it mimics a neuroblast. It mimics a mature teratoma. Probably the clues that we should have taken is a 4-year-old child with a predominant solid mass, and not many features suggestive of a mature teratoma. Should we have gone ahead with a biopsy, neoadjuvant chemotherapy, and then probably surgery? That's my question to the surgeons. Sir?
Yes, ma'am. Now, that's what it looks like. As in, we were not sure about neuroblastoma
Yeah.
as per the initial diagnosis.
Yes, sir.
So we thought sacral coxal. Now, after probably feel.
So the next kid that we get, what are we going to do? It's a learning lesson for me also. Like, I was also quite sure presacral mass, it looks like a teratoma. So probably for the next child, a biopsy would be a good way to go, isn't it? Hello? So that's the reason I asked, is if there are any pointers to suggest that it could be a malignant lesion or a neuroblastoma. But like Anusha said, there's not any clear-cut imaging findings which can tell us that we were not dealing with a mature teratoma and most likely dealing with a malignant lesion.
And Pooja, one second, and any tumor markers were done? You were thinking of a teratoma?
Yes, ma'am. It was alpha fetoprotein and beta HCG were normal, ma'am. What we were thinking was a mature teratoma only. Probably that's why they thought the tumor markers were normal.
Okay.
Yeah, ma'am. I think I've angered a few surgeons over here now. Let's go on to the next case. Hello?
Ma'am, could you repeat the question?
Am I audible, Dr. Vinay?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, you're audible, ma'am.
Somebody has to mute their mic, I think. Anusha. Yeah, I'll just mute her. Yeah. Can you hear me now clearly? Yeah. So my question is, if we get a child like this, an older child with a presacral mass, predominantly solid lesion next time, probably would be a good idea to go ahead with a biopsy first. Yes?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
We would have a tumor board discussion once again.
Fine.
Can I take that?
Yes, sir. Please.
Good one, Vinay. Good one.
Sure.
Exactly, because I did see that, especially dissecting in that area in a child,
Yes,
the
sir.
presacral region and trying to shave it off from the sacrum is a bit scary in the sense I did see
Yes, sir.
Dr. Ramesh sir do it. So
Yes, sir.
I think if we are really clear with the histopathology and we know what needs to be done, that would add to the ease of surgery, and we know that we are doing the right thing. So
Yes,
that
sir.
definitely having a pre of histopathology and chemotherapy would definitely help, because it's a no man area in the sense you can't access it from the perineum or from the abdomen. So it's
Yes,
little tough dissecting in that. So if you know you have to shave it off from the sacrum, will as well do it. But if we can stay away from it and upfront we know what type of radicalness we need to
Exactly,
do,
sir.
then it would definitely be a lot of help.
Agreed, sir.
Ma'am, in this case, why did we categorize it as L2, ma'am? I didn't get what based on what image.
Actually, I think it was extending beyond one compartment to the pelvis, from the pelvis to the upper part also. I don't know the exact findings. I was just discussing it with radiology people before the tumor board. I haven't seen the entire sections of the CT. So based on that, I think he has categorized it as L2, and there were some image-defined risk factors also. I wanted to see them, but they don't have the sections now.
Okay.
Actually, Dr. Vaishali had described them, but they don't have the section now. It's okay. I think we can discuss it beyond the tumor board. We'll take up the third case now.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Vinay?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, this is a 1 month, 9 days old term male child who was brought with history of respiratory distress since 1 week. Antenatal history was normal. Child did not have any fever or excessive crying. But child on admission was had tachypnea with substernal retractions. His pulse was 130, BP was normal. Saturation was 99% on room air. So we got an X-ray done. This was the X-ray, which probably showed like left side was fairly normal, but right side it looked like some homogeneous opacity on the right middle and lower zone.
Yeah.
So we suspected a mass lesion. So on the X-ray, based on the X-ray, we thought it is at this age, 1 month, we thought probably it is a pulmonary sequestration or some intrapulmonary mass. So,
Okay.
So then we went ahead with the CT scan.
Yeah. Can you please describe the CT scan findings?
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
So plain and post contrast CT scan of the thorax of the child was provided to us. We can see that there is a soft tissue density intrathoracic mass lesion seen in the thorax with the broad base towards the mediastinal pleura and the pre and the right paravertebral region. The lesion measures 4.7 into 3.2 into 4.5 centimeters and shows calcifications on the plain scan. Then on the post-contrast scan, the lesion shows a heterogeneous post-contrast enhancement. So here we can see that there is heterogeneous post-contrast enhancement in the mass lesion. Then posteriorly and laterally, the lesion abuts the costal pleura. So, and it is seen to extend into the superior segment of the right lung, superior segment of the right lower lobe and posterior segment of right upper lobe. The lesion is seen medially to extend to the middle and the posterior mediastinum with compression of the trachea and the right main bronchus and displacement of the esophagus and the mediastinum to the left side. The lesion is seen to closely abut the vertebrae, lower lumbar vertebrae from, not lower lumbar, sorry, thoracic vertebrae from D2 to D9 level. However, intraspinal extension could not be made out. We would like to do an MRI to see for intraspinal extension.
Okay.
Then in the lung window, ma'am, there were many areas of consolidation noted.
Okay.
In the left lung as well as in the right lung. Atelectatic and consolidatory areas which are most likely infective. Rest of the bone window and the visualized abdomen was normal.
Okay.
So differential diagnosis were, first was neuroblastoma and less likely was a pleuropulmonary blastoma.
Okay.
Next, coming to the discussion.
Yeah.
So according to the, we use the International Neuroblastoma Risk Groups Classification System.
Okay.
And in this patient, there were two image-defined risk factors wherein the tumor was seen to compress the trachea and the right bronchus,
Okay.
and it was seen to infiltrate the costovertebral junction at the level of T9.
Okay.
So the intraspinal extension we couldn't make out on the CT scan provided. We would like to do an MRI for the same.
Okay.
So these are the other infiltration. This was not seen, and there was no evidence of pleural effusion in this case.
Okay.
So this tumor fell into L2 category, where there was presence of one or more image-defined risk factor.
So that would have probably been prudent if we had proven, we not sure, but we are most likely dealing with a neuroblastoma. So it's L2 with two image-defined risk factors, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So the histopathology part, can we just discuss? I think, Dr. Vinay, can you just describe the course of events? You initially tried an FNAC in this child, isn't it? And then the child had some complication post-procedure.
Yes, ma'am. We were planning for, based on the radiological finding, we planned for FNAC. So we planned for an ultrasound guided FNAC. When we turned the child towards the lateral position itself, child went into apnea. So we didn't even attempt the procedure. We shifted the child to ICU, and then with the help of in the ICU, we did an ultrasound guided FNAC, and we sent the slides to St. John's. So there, the report they told that it was a small round blue cell tumor, but they're not sure of the exact cause for this one. But they said with that amount of this one, they were not able to do IHC also. So they wanted a repeat biopsy or a true cut.
Okay, so I think we did it was reported, the FNAC was reported in at Kidwai, as well as a biopsy was also reported. So can we please have the histopathology findings from for this child?
We got 8 stain slides for review here, which were labeled as FNAC from intrathoracic mass.
Yeah.
And these are the HND stain slides, which were quite cellular. And what we saw were in these cellular areas were all small round cells, which were arranged in loosely cohesive manner. And in the high upper view, we can see that these small round cells are set in a fibrillary background, that is nothing but the neuropil. And this is a pap stained slide of the same, where we can see in the lower power the vague rosetting pattern. And here in the right side corner, it's the same round cell set in the fibrillary background. There was a biopsy also for the review, which was inconclusive. Only some skeletal muscle fragments were there. So the final impression was given based on this FNAC small round cell neoplasm, that is neuroblastoma.
Yeah, I would just like to describe why we have kept this child for, like, although the diagnosis has not been confirmed. This neonate presented with a pleural based mass, and on whatever histopathology we could elicit for this child, it was suggestive of a small blue round cell tumor, and neuroblastoma was a most likely finding. These parents, however, chose to go to another hospital for treatment, and they are currently taking treatment at Narayana Hridayalaya, and where the child was treated as a case of neuroblastoma and given 1 cycle of chemotherapy. Post that, the child developed multiple episodes of seizures and was also ventilated for around 48 to 72 hours. And they were contemplating whether to go ahead with chemotherapy or to excise the mass. So they also conducted a biopsy over there at that hospital, and there they were considering the possibility of malignant germ cell tumors. Malignant germ cell tumor, which feels a little off because you don't see the characteristic small round cell neoplasm that has been described. So we were not sure as to what this tumor will turn out to be. Finally, yesterday the child has undergone excision of the mass. So I will be updating you in the next tumor board as to what this has turned out to be. This will be an interesting case as to what finally turned out to be the diagnosis for this child. So looking at whatever histopathology findings we have, it looks like a neuroblastoma in this child. I'll keep you updated on the next, but on radiology as well as histopathology, it looks like a small round blue cell tumor. So can we go ahead with the next case, please?
Pooja, just I would like to add something.
Yes, ma'am.
The one is that cytologically it looks like neuroblastoma only.
Yes, ma'am.
Such fibrillary background we will not see in any other small round cell tumor.
Exactly, sir. Exactly.
That is one thing. And another thing is, if neuroblastoma is suspected, then FNA smears, only 2 smears can be air dried and kept if you are suspecting neuroblastoma, because
Yes,
we can do NMIC by fish on the smears also. It need not be on a biopsy.
Okay, ma'am.
So 2 extra smears can be air dried and kept if neuroblastoma is suspected.
Yes, ma'am. We had sent to.
Probably they've already fixed slides, not fresh slides, I think. So, ma'am, on the fixed slides, can we do the NMIC?
Yes,
review
yes,
slides?
yes. Hello.
Not fixed slides, air dried smears.
Yes, ma'am. Air dried smears. Okay. They were fixed, I think, the ones which were sent.
Yes, and stained. They were already stained.
That's why it was not possible to do. But I'm quite sure, ma'am, like you described the neuropil and the small blue round cell, unlikely to be malignant GCT. Anyways, we'll come to know in another week or 10 days, and I will keep everyone posted as to what that child turned out to be.
Yeah. We would like to see those slides too.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, for sure. I'm in touch with the patient, and I will get back to you.
Yes,
The last case for discussion today?
yes, ma'am. This is a 6-month-old male child who was brought with history of a small swelling in the right cheek of about 2 into 2 centimeters, which parents noticed since birth. Then the swelling gradually increased to the present size of up to 7 into 5 centimeters. Then there was reddish discoloration of the skin. At 3 months of age, child was worked up at Serchi Hospital in Shivamogga, where the initial evaluation HP was 8 counts 7,800, and platelets were 23,000. Ma'am.
Yeah. So now we'll describe the radiology findings for this child, please.
Yes, ma'am.
Who will be describing the radiology findings? Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Mariam from Kidwai.
Yeah,
I'm going to present the case of 3-month-old, 2-month-old infant who came with swelling in the right cheek and three. This is a plain CT plain CT axial section showing evidence of a large soft tissue density lesion seen in the right side of the neck, and it is involving the right parapharyngeal space, right masseteric space. Superiorly, it is extending to the infratemporal fossa, and inferiorly up to the supraclavicular fossa. And medially, it is infiltrating the tongue. This plain CT, I would like to describe the extensions on the MRI, contrast enhanced MRI examination.
Yeah.
This is a contrast enhanced MRI neck was done for the patient, and this is an axial T2 stir images showing hyperintense lesion on the right side of the neck. The lesion is involving the right parotid space, and medially it is extending to the right parapharyngeal space. As we can see, it is showing intraoral extension, and it is involving the right half of the tongue with slight extension across the midline, and inferiorly it is involving the floor of the mouth. Posteriorly, it is extending to the posterior pharyngeal wall and displacing the laryngeal airway to the left side. And anteriorly, it is extending up to the alveolar process of the mandible. The lesion is seen displacing the vessels, external carotid and internal carotid vessels medially, and we can see the branches of external carotid artery going within the lesion. So it is supplying the lesion, and laterally it is extending up to the skin surface, and inferiorly it is extending up to the supraclavicular fossa.
Okay.
This is a T2 image. Here we can see the lesion is showing heterogeneous T2 hyperintense lesion with some multiple hypointense areas within here, which could represent phlebolyths. And this is a contrast image, contrast MRI axial section showing that the lesion is showing heterogeneous examination, heterogeneous enhancement. And going back to CT, here we can see that there's no evidence of any bony erosion.
Okay.
This is the bone window. We can see that there's no erosion of the mandible. The lesion is seen insinuating between the facial planes, whereas there's no destruction of any bone.
Okay.
So from the above finding, like there's a large heterogeneous intensity lesion noted in the right side of the neck involving the parapharyngeal space with which is seen encasing the parotid gland and the muscles. And also there is appearance of T2 hypointense lesion which could like be phlebolyth. So considering the age of the patient, which is an infant, so the commonest first differential would be a vascular tumor because of the presence of T2 hypo. These are the T2 hypointensities within the lesion.
Okay.
So a vascular tumor, and in literature most common infantile vascular tumor would be a hemangioma, and the second DD we would give as a rhabdomyosarcoma, but it is if you compare it with a hemangioma, as we can see, a rhabdomyosarcoma will be little more aggressive as compared to a hemangioma, and there will be destruction of the bone, which is not seen in our case. And also this lesion is seen extending between the facial planes into the intraoral compartment. So hemangiomas are known to extend that way. So my first DD would be a hemangioma.
Okay. Fine, Dr. Mariam.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fine. I think there was some ambiguity about the exact nature of this lesion because the child was considered as a hemangioendothelioma and was started on treatment. Yeah, Dr. Vinay, you can just describe what we had done for the child and why we had to go ahead with the biopsy.
Yes. At Surgery Hospital itself, based on the MRI finding, they had started the child on propranolol and syrup, prednisolone in oral format, and they had given that for 2 months. But the child, there was no improvement. So then they referred the child to our hospital. So at our hospital, it was same thing. Swelling was about 18 to 6 centimeters in size, and it was arising from the right cheek with diffuse borders, variegated consistency, and few hard areas with some soft areas were were felt. So and skin over the swelling was hyperemic. At admission also, in our hospital also, hemoglobin was 7.8 and platelets were 13,000. So then what we did was we planned to increase instead of an oral prednisolone, we made it IV prednisolone, and propanol also. Based on the body weight, we increased the dose. But still, there was no reduction in the size of the lesion, and platelet also did not show any significant improvement. So we reviewed the MRI with at Kidwai, and they felt because of this RMS as a second possibility, we went ahead with the true cut biopsy.
Yeah, I would just like to make a point over here. There are 2 points which are, against RMS in this particular child. One is that the lesion was present since birth. Although congenital RMS is known, it's not a common entity. And this child had this lesion since birth, which was vascular in nature with a, typical hue which was present and progressively increasing size. So that is point number 1, the presence since birth. It's usually seen in case of hemangiomas. The second point is the thrombocytopenia, which was noted in this picture. So usually, if a child with RMS is there, you usually don't see involvement like this unless there is infiltration of the tumor into the marrow, in which case the child would be very sick. So both these points favored more in terms of a hemangioendothelioma with probably a Kasabach-Merritt phenomenon. All right. Yeah, Dr. Vinay. So next we went ahead with the biopsy. Dr. Sulagna, can you describe the biopsy for this child?
Yeah. Is it seen?
Yeah.
Okay. So we received 2 linear gray soft tissue cores from this child, and in the microscopy we saw the neoplastic cells, which were generally spindle to oval cells that we see here. They were generally arranged in the fascicular form, the vague nodular form that we can appreciate from here, and also in like vague lobules. So, and there was abundant vascular proliferation as we see here, and also congestion were also noted. This is a hyper view of the vascular proliferation, and also we noted mitosis, which was 2 to 3 per 10 hyper field. So based on the morphology, we kept the 2 differentials of hemangioma and hemangioendothelioma. But as we proceeded with the IHC, there was a clinical differential for rhabdomyosarcoma, so we had also put the markers for the rhabdomyosarcoma also. So as we moved with the IHC, so we saw that it was like strong membranous positivity, CD31 positivity, strong membranous CD34 positivity, and the Ki67 was around 6 to 8%. And desmin and myogenin, which were the markers for the we had put for differentiating rhabdomyosarcoma, they all turned to be negative. So based on the IHC findings, morphology, and correlating with the clinically and radiologically, we came to a final diagnosis of capaciform hemangioendothelioma. So moving ahead and talking a bit about the vascular tumors, they can be benign, borderline, and malignant. The benign ones are the hemangioma, aquatufted hemangioma, intramuscular, atriovenous, and epithelioid. In the borderline, which is the capaciform hemangioendothelioma, the papillary intralymphatic angioendothelioma, retiform, composite, and Kaposi sarcoma. The malignant ones are the angiosarcoma and epithelioid hemangioma. So we generally differentiate the benign from the intermediate and malignant. Always we should correlate with the clinical findings along with the radiology. So infantile hemangioma basically presents at the age around 5 to 7 weeks of age. They are mainly superficial, but can also liver can have they are least aggressive, and GLUT1 in the IHC should be done, and where the GLUT1 is positive. We can differentiate the congenital hemangiomas from the infantile ones through GLUT1 positivity and negativity, and also the congenital hemangiomas usually present in utero and present fully formed at the birth. And it is also not aggressive. And again, there are three forms, like it is rapidly involuting congenital hemangioma, and then non-involuting, and there is partially involuting. Coming to the capiciform hemangioendothelioma, which was like our case, this was again a child. This can present in adults also, but this is most common in the child, which is less than 5 years. And this can be like a skin deep soft tissue. It can occur like within the skin, soft tissue, retroperitoneal, mediastinum. And generally, they develop the Kasabach-Merritt phenomena, and these tumors appears to grow, and which, as the clinical history says, that the tumor got enlarged to like 7 into 5 centimeter in size. And also the IHC will support the diagnosis because of staining of CD31, D240 and GLUT1 negativity. This will also help to differentiate from the benign from the intermediate ones. And Kaposi sarcoma, basically they are HHV8 positivity associated with the HIV, and they are highly aggressive tumors. So then talking a bit about the Kasabach-Merritt phenomenon, actually these like capiciform hemangioendothelioma is associated with GNA14 mutations. A few cases are reported, and also this phenomenon is associated with the platelet trapping within the tumoral vascular beds, and the podoplanin is the natural ligand for CLEC2. So why I am emphasizing on this point, because if we give platelet transfusions to this patient, the patient will not improve actually. The thrombocytopenia will not improve in the patient. Then there are the diagnostic criteria WHO defined. So the deep lesions which have the capiciform hemangioendothelioma pattern, they should have the ill-defined coalescing nodules composed of the fascicles of the plump spindle endothelial cells, and the spindle cells should be positive for CD31, ERG34, and lymphatic markers, that is podoplanin and LYVI. So and this patient, I think so, presented with the Kasabach-Merritt phenomenon, because as the article from the Orphanet Journal of Rare Disease, Cheng et al. Describes that almost 42 to 71% of the patient demonstrate with the Kasabach-Merritt phenomenon. So thrombocytopenia is usually severe, and as we see in the child, it is 22,000 of the platelets, and this tumor grow very rapidly, and the risk of the capiciform hemangioendothelioma developing Kasabach-Merritt phenomena, especially when the tumor size is extremely large, more than 7 centimeter. So mostly, so on the basis of all this, we get to a diagnosis of this capiciform hemangioendothelioma. So this article will support the diagnosis, as it states that that the capiciform hemangioendothelioma may develop like life-threatening thrombocytopenia with the consumptive coagulopathy known as Kasabach-Merritt phenomena. And also there is one more article which states that they had done like examined 3 children which was initially misdiagnosed as an infantile hemangioma, but later developed Kasabach-Merritt syndrome.
Dr. Pooja.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I would be giving those. We'll go through this meeting.
Yes,
then
sir.
We have a collection of patients where we have managed these children with
Yes, sir.
all about 4 children as of now, with
Definitely,
varying
sir.
degrees of treatment strategies.
Yes, sir.
And I think we can put it up and we can have a discussion on that definitely. And the photographs I would definitely.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, we'll share it on the tumor board
all the
group.
patients involved. Yes.
Is that okay, ma'am?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah. So now this child's course, I think, like Vinay said, we had already increased the dose of propranolol, and also the dose of like IV methylprednisolone was given for the child. However, the child did not respond. So the next line of therapy that we had planned for this child was either giving injectable vincristine or sirolimus. These are the 2 drugs which have shown very good response in these children. We explained the the complications, likely complications of therapy, the likelihood of response. However, because the child is very young, 6 months, and the concept of chemotherapy was not very acceptable to the parents, they decided to wait on the child and continue with the propranolol as of now. So he is currently only on propranolol and has not been started on any of the treatment. They said that they'll be following back after a month, after which if the tumor has not regressed in size, they will be deciding on further therapy. So like Dr. Sulagna already said, this is a good article which I will be sharing on the group. One second. Yeah. So can all of you view my screen now?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so this is the article that Dr. Sulagna was discussing, Kaposiform hemangioendothelioma, current knowledge and future perspectives. So this clearly illustrates what are the drugs which are used. So corticosteroids we've already used, vincristine, sirolimus, interferon alpha subcutaneous injections have been tried, as well as propranolol in the doses of 2 to 3 mg per kg per day. And it also indicates when supportive vaccine needs to be given in these children. So I think the next step for us would be to give vincristine intravenously for this child. So I think that is all for today. And any other comments or any other suggestions for improving the future presentations?
No, as regarding this hemangioendothelioma.
Yes, sir.
Yes, so one was the clinical this thing, radiological this thing was mentioned of fast standing. That's what I want to discuss with the radiologist. Maybe
Yes, sir.
subsequent meetings we can.
No, sir, we can discuss it now. Not a problem. We still have time.
Second one is the consensus, which has come in American Academy of Pediatrics, where they gave a consensus statement for management of this group type of children, where they said monotherapy may not be useful. So you start with propranolol, then with steroid, or propranolol with vincristine.
Yes,
and in the course of this years now, we have seen children only getting treated with propranolol only. Some getting very adversely worsened with propranolol. So probably further, as pathologists have highlighted, maybe doing further markers and looking at them, and then deciding on the treatment option would definitely would be in the thing. Though they are so very rare, maybe as they come, we can collate and then we can go ahead with that. Yes.
That's a good point. So actually, we learned that from the biopsy. Like when she illustrated the differences between the lesions, it was quite a good point to take probably in the future cases also. And like you said, sir, they have mentioned corticosteroid plus vincristine or corticosteroid plus sirolimus. Monotherapy might not be very efficacious in these children.
Yes, yes. And of course, surgery plays a role where it is accessible, especially if it's in the abdominal wall or in the extremities. But on the face and things, it will be, can be unless, it's a devastating.
Yes, sir.
So, ma'am, what would be the indications? Because these hemangioendothelioma, we usually diagnose based on radiological findings, clinical presentation, and associated Keseberg-Merez syndrome. When do we actually subject these for biopsy? In this child, it was clear that because we had a differential of RMS, we went in. But is it mandatory to have a histological diagnosis for all vascular tumors?
Basically, whatever I also read, it said the same thing, that the diagnosis is predominantly clinical and based on radiology. But like you have a child over here, probably if you were treating it like a hemangioma and you're seeing that the child is not responding very well to treatment, and it's more, I think it would be prudent to go ahead with the biopsy like we did in this case. 2 months already of propranolol and steroid, child not showing much response. I think that would be one of the indications where we would go ahead and biopsy. But definite indications, probably we can review and discuss them in the next class.
Sure.
So if that is all, anybody else would like to make any comments, suggestions that we can improve the meeting next time? Fine. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, especially, faculty from Kidwai and, all my senior colleagues from surgery here at Indira Gandhi, especially the pathology